Thank you to everyone. So my presentation about Georgia is very typical. Very specific presentation, but why it's interesting, maybe for the wider audience. Generally, when we are speaking about this, the resilience, traditionally we regarded resilience and security from the understanding of hopes and tradition when it comes to the security about the international security, just political institutions, just army, and so on, so on. But sometimes, the last times also some good questions like economic resilience, economic security also played quite a big role in the construction of security in general. But I think that from this point of view, the minority issues, sometimes we can just connect with these security issues, especially in the countries with so-called late modernization and late formation of so-called nation state, unlike all the countries who started to construct their nation state in 19th century at the beginning, especially in 19th century. The Georgia is a country of so-called late modernization who started to construct its nation state in at the beginning of the 20th century. We had only a 3 years republic, then Soviet Russians came there and they established the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the kind of new type of so-called modernized states, from the one side who was based on egalitarianism and self-determination, national self-determination, but at the same time it was a new type of the Russian Empire, I would say. So what's interesting is that traditionally for the Eastern, so-called Eastern European countries, the minority issues are closely connected with the securitization the process. As far as those countries constructed the state a little bit late. And when, especially if you take the period so-called interwar periods, you will see lots of so-called ethnic tensions and ethnic conflict within the states, because the heritage they got from the big empires was sometimes was not really compatible with their traditional understanding of their nation and national self-determination. So now, if you take a Georgian case, we can just see the several problems from the point of view of why we can connect the securitization process to the resilience institution. The first one is a so-called Soviet socio-cultural past. Another one is so-called moral standard international obligations. The third one is so-called the process of civil integration and the results of civil integration of minorities within the one society. So this is Georgia. This is the ethnic part. We will see this one. Actually, if we go to the census of Georgia, we will see these percentages of ethnic composition of Georgia. And now about 86% of the local Georgian population is ethnically the Georgians. From this point of view, it's not seems very heterogeneous. Let's say it seems more little bit homogeneous. But if you take into consideration what does it mean to be a big minority with the Georgian case, and not only Georgia, within the former Soviet states in general. If you take in this case Azerians, Azerians, Armenians cases who are populated to the southern part there. What does it mean? That means that the compactly populated minorities, they are not integrated as one society. They are quite standing a little bit outside of the society. So I explain why. This census of 1989, the last census of Soviet Union, and by those times, ethnic composition of Georgia was more heterogeneous. Then we compare the actual situation. Why? Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some problems. We got these former Soviet states, and we got lots of problems within the internal wars. Caused economic problems, caused the big immigration outside the country, and so on. So this type of problem is more or less the same for the whole post-Soviet states. So What does the Soviet context? Soviet context means to understand the nation and ethnicity absolutely in different terms. What I mean, if you take the typical Western nation state, for example, even I don't know, France or the Portugal, everyone, being the part of the nation, it means, first of all, coming from the citizenship. But if you take the Soviet case and the Soviet Union case, the idea of nationality is not a citizenship. Idea of nationality is strongly ethnicity. So that's why if we were taking the former communist states and we were talking about this ethnic, the heterogeneity of this situation. Why is it dangerous? It's dangerous because ethnicity, so-called nationalities, even Soviet understanding, they feel themselves totally estranged from the given society. They don't feel themselves as a part of, generalized nation, not just the nation of the citizens. That means coming from the idea of democracy and representative government. So when the former Soviet states that just started to construct the neoliberal democracies, they immediately got this, the problems. Even now, if you take the Ukrainian situation, you will never understand Ukrainian situation if you don't understand the cases, because so-called the Russian population in the eastern part of Ukraine, most of they felt themselves not a part of Ukraine. They felt themselves part of Russia, because their process of socialization, it wasn't a strategy to construct Ukrainian community as a community of citizens. It was a project to construct Ukraine as a, let's say, coexistence of different nations. So that's why when the former Soviet states there is starting to construct a new nation state in terms of liberal democracies, they have to somehow to overcome this problem to re-socialize minorities that they got from the Soviet past. Because in Soviet past, being a minority meant being a part of social group within the big hierarchy of a society. It wasn't just being a part of just a cultural group. It was a part of a social group. So, from another side, Georgia is a part of many regulations from the international context, like many European Framework Convention of Minorities, some part of OSCE, and you'll see it on the screen. And what does it mean? That means that Georgia should not only is obliged to integrate the minority within their society, but at the same time, they should integrate minority within the society because of international regulations as well. So that's why this is another challenge. That's why for the country, how to handle this from the one side, from the past and present they are giving, at the same time, how to handle with these international obligations. Now, if you take some sociological polls, we got lots of polls in Georgia about these minority issues. Most of these compactly populated minorities, they don't speak Georgian as a state language. They speak mostly in their own languages, because during the Soviet times, minorities mostly they were taught in their own ethnic languages and Russian. They have a high competency in Russian. Georgia, for example, for them, it was like a second-hand language because of Georgia was a part in its terms the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, it was the Russian Empire. We can see lots of researches about the Soviet Union, how they construct this, let's say, community of different nations. We can just see many Sovietologists who say that how they kept, for example, Lenin kept idea of self-determination, and Soviet Union was composed by the so-called national republics, and it was a kind of paradise of the for different nationalities. But in reality, this was a new form of Russian Empire. But it's Lenin just a little bit reconstruct the empire which they got from the Romanovs Empire. They started to reconstruct this idea, but the Soviet idea, what was the main Soviet idea? The Russia is a big brother for everyone. Russian language is primarily the most of the desirable language for everyone. It's the state obliged language, and all the other languages and the nations or nationalities, they were subordinated to this big brotherhood, who was led by Russians. So that's why this so-called titular nations politics, going from the 20s or 30s, within the one national republics, they made several nations within the one nation. So that's why minorities are not just ordinary minorities, they are just nations within the nations. What's the conclusion that that's why I mean that when we're talking about the resilience and the resilience of institutions and economics and so on, from this understanding, from my understanding, sometimes it's possible also to connect these issues to the minority issues, because once again, for the former Soviet Union countries, the countries of so-called late modernization, minorities, it's not just a part of just cultural diversity and cultural, just coexistence or multiculturalism, like if you take Western societies, for example. Yeah, even for Western society, sometimes if you take the theories of postmodernism, deconstruction, and so on, the idea of nations was just out of the modernity, out of the current situation. But I see that Ukrainian Russians were in Ukraine, back bring the idea of nation. Once again, it confronts, I would say, the idea of postmodernist, like it was developed in the Western society by those times. That's why, okay, from the one side, we have the society of, Western European and just Western society. From the other hand, we had also more or less the Western society, but with little bit with different histories and different contexts. And that's why the traditional concept that we are taking from the Western parts, which are just trying to use it in the not Western context, we should somehow to handle with local peculiarities. In this case, minority issues are one of the peculiarities of the former communist Soviet countries that should be understood even from the understanding of resilience and security. Thanks so much.